On a chilly December morning, in a quiet street on the outskirts of the city, a strange event unfolded when a young woman, dressed in an unkempt outfit, drove out of her house. Little did she know that an unexpected encounter with the police would turn the day into a series of chaotic events. The location was her peaceful neighborhood, where officers had been casually observing and following her actions, which ultimately led to a tense and contentious situation. From the very first line, the woman displayed her frustration and defensive attitude. "Excuse me, officer," she huffed. "Why are you following me?" Her words not only showed surprise but also skepticism and a lack of cooperation. This attitude made it clear to the reader that she felt invaded, despite the fact that the officer's actions were entirely justified. She believed she had done nothing wrong, and the police's presence only heightened her feeling of being unnecessarily surveilled. Next, her sarcastic remark, "Did I pull out of my driveway too stylishly for your liking?" was a prime example of her using irony and flippant humor to downplay the tension in the situation. Not only did she come off as self-important, but she also displayed a blatant disrespect for the officer, portraying herself as someone who believed her mere presence was so remarkable that it would attract police attention. Her attitude was further clarified by the statement, "I mean, you were just sitting on my block like it's your personal viewing gallery." Here, the woman didn't just describe the officer's actions but gave them an absurd twist, imagining the police as spectators at a personal performance. She clearly rejected the idea of the officers patrolling her street, seeing it as an unwarranted invasion of her space. Finally, the comment, "Do you follow everyone in the neighborhood this closely, or am I just that fascinating?" was a clear display of her self-importance and lack of respect for the police's work. The woman saw herself as the center of attention, believing the officer's interest in her was purely because she was too captivating to ignore. This question, both sarcastic and challenging, created a direct confrontation with the officer, despite the fact that she was the one in violation. The officer, though facing a potentially escalating situation, remained calm and asked, "Ma'am, were you wearing your seatbelt?" At that moment, Chloe's gaze sharpened, her eyes reflecting clear disapproval and irritation. It was as if she were being interrogated in a courtroom, with every question attacking her freedom. "Of course I was. Why wouldn't I?" Chloe responded, her voice rising with anger. "But you know, it's so hot, I just took it off a bit to let my body breathe. What's the big deal, right?" She didn't just deny the officer's question. She also exhibited obvious frustration, seemingly believing that the police had no right to intervene in her small personal choices. She tried to redirect the conversation, hoping the officer would empathize with her more if he knew she was simply taking care of herself while driving. Chloe emphasized that although removing the seatbelt may have been against the law, it was entirely reasonable given the heat she was facing. At this moment, it's clear that Chloe is shifting the argument from a legal issue to a more personal and relatable matter, as if she's seeking the officer's agreement on her discomfort. She's no longer simply protesting the officer's actions. She begins to engage in a dialogue as though the officer is a specialist in personal comfort, much like one would consult an expert in weather or fashion, rather than a law enforcement officer. In Chloe's eyes, her comfort and personal decisions take precedence over any traffic laws or regulations. This marks a tense moment in the confrontation between Chloe and the officer, where she displays excessive defensiveness and tries to maintain control of the situation by making unreasonable demands. When the officer asks Chloe to provide her driver's license, she reacts unexpectedly and somewhat flustered. She freezes, her hands gripping the steering wheel as if it's the only thing keeping her calm in this tense moment. This action shows an irrational fear and a very clear defensive attitude, as though she's been cornered and is now feeling under attack. Almost immediately, Chloe dramatically declares that she cannot provide her documents right away. She demands to call her mother or lawyer first, as if it were a basic right she could not forego. Her statement seems to be an attempt to slow the process and assert personal power in a situation where she has no control. However, this request is clearly a stalling tactic, a way for her to avoid facing the truth of the situation and to exhibit a marked lack of cooperation with law enforcement. The act of pulling out her phone and dialing seems like a calculated move, but in reality, Chloe might just be playing a role for the officer's benefit, since making a phone call is not something she genuinely needs to do at this moment. She's adding complexity and confusion to the situation, as though contacting her mother or lawyer will somehow release her from the discomfort. But in truth, it's simply a psychological maneuver, a performance to draw attention and stall for time, all while refusing to confront the fact that she's violated the law. This situation highlights the conflict between personal entitlement and civic responsibility, as well as how Chloe uses theatrics to escalate the tension rather than resolve the issue reasonably. Her attitude reflects a profound disrespect for law enforcement and the societal expectations of compliance with regulations, showcasing her tendency to be self-centered and to express dissatisfaction when things don't go her way. While Chloe waits for the fictional lawyer to return her call, she doesn't just display impatience but also an escalating sense of resentment toward the situation. She criticizes the officer, accusing him of an illogical, gender-based motive. "I bet you stopped me because I'm a woman. You're being sexist. I need a female officer, someone who can understand my pain." This statement is not just an exaggeration of the situation, but also an emotional resistance to the authority and control that the officer represents. She creates a scenario in which her gender is the only reason she's being stopped, despite having no real basis for making this accusation. Chloe's words reflect not just her anger, but also a misunderstanding of the actual reason for the traffic stop. She diverts attention from her own behavior, such as not wearing a seatbelt or possibly committing other traffic violations, toward blaming a broader social issue in an attempt to absolve herself of responsibility. Her statement is filled with blame and denial, further escalating the tension in the situation. As she looked at the officer, Chloe's gaze not only conveyed contempt but also seemed deeply personal, as if she had been offended on a fundamental level. She stared at the officer as if he were the only one to blame in the world, and his actions had wounded her pride. This look was not merely dissatisfaction but carried a profound sense of irritation, as though the officer's presence had ruined her entire day. This incident was not just a minor dispute between a traffic violator and a police officer, but rather a reflection of Chloe's arrogance and lack of self-awareness. She refused to take responsibility for her actions and instead tried to bring a larger social issue into this personal confrontation, effectively obscuring the true nature of the matter, a simple traffic violation. When the officer began questioning Chloe about her vehicle registration, her response immediately became tense and filled with frustration. Chloe exploded, shouting, "What's wrong with my temporary plates? I just bought this car. It's brand new. Why are you attacking my vehicle's identity?" Her words were laced with frustration and discomfort, as if she felt she was under attack not only on a legal level but also with regard to her identity and privacy. At this point, Chloe was not merely reacting to the interrogation but also showing impatience with what she perceived as an invasion of her personal space. Despite the officer's attempts to remain calm and keep the situation under control, he found it nearly impossible to interject or provide any explanation. She had turned the dialogue into a tense argument, where logic and reasoning had little room to breathe. Every question from the officer was seen by Chloe as an infringement on her personal rights, making the entire exchange exhausting and futile. It was Chloe's attitude, unwilling to cooperate and overly self-assured, that complicated the situation, leaving the officer flustered in his attempt to resolve the matter. Eventually, the officer's patience ran out. In a firm tone, still striving to maintain composure, he said, "Ma'am, if you do not provide your driver's license immediately, I will have to arrest you for obstruction of justice." His words rang out clearly, highlighting the rising tension between the two. Chloe, who had previously been strong-willed and resistant to control, now widened her eyes, feigning surprise as if she had been caught off guard. "Arrest me? For what?" "Just because I'm trying to go to work and live my best life." She shook her head continuously, her expression that of a victim caught in a huge misunderstanding. A wave of anger surged within her, causing her to throw her hands up uncontrollably, prompting a car behind to slam on the brakes, creating a minor traffic jam that was incidental but still notable. With that attitude, Chloe not only ignored the officer's request but also saw her actions as part of a righteous struggle for personal freedom. By treating her refusal to cooperate with the police as part of her great life, She highlighted her arrogance and defiance. Instead of acknowledging the seriousness of the situation, Chloe seemed to turn it into a challenge to prove herself. Her exaggerated actions not only heightened the tension of the conversation, but also began to draw attention from those around her, as if she were starring in a play with a script she had written herself. Chloe's approach to the officer, especially when she created chaos with exaggerated gestures, was a clear reflection of her attitude of not tolerating interference in her personal freedom. She viewed this not as an act of law enforcement, but as an invasion into her small, free world. Chloe continued to argue, her voice becoming more shrill and arrogant. "I'm not resisting arrest, but you guys are really aggressive. Don't you see that you're making me uncomfortable? You should take a customer service course," she said, lifting her chin as if she were pointing out a serious flaw in the behavior of high-end restaurant staff, rather than facing a serious arrest situation. She reclined in her seat, her hand still gripping the steering wheel, but her demeanor showed no sign of worry or fear. Her actions seemed as if she were attending a therapy session, where she was the center of attention and the officers were merely the ones required to listen to her advice. Chloe's words, instead of acknowledging the gravity of the situation, portrayed her as a challenger of authority, even acting as if she were being inconvenienced by law enforcement rather than being arrested for traffic violations. Chloe's sarcasm in her words not only reflects her defiant attitude toward law enforcement, but also underscores her utter disrespect for the situation at hand. Instead of recognizing that she is in a tense and serious situation with the police, she perceives her arrest as no different from a customer service interaction, where she plays the role of a difficult customer demanding better service. Her smug demeanor and condescending tone further elevate the drama, as she seems unbothered by the consequences of her actions. Rather than acknowledging the seriousness of the arrest, she continues to nitpick, complain, and make it seem as though the police officers should be responsible for her discomfort, as if this were an informal meeting rather than a confrontation with the law. In this passage, Chloe's confusion and extreme anxiety are clearly demonstrated through her melodramatic outbursts. "I need to speak to my lawyer." "No, wait, I need to talk to my mom." "I don't understand why this is happening." She seems oblivious to the gravity of the situation and instead focuses solely on contacting family members as though that is the only solution to getting her out of this predicament. Her shift in requests, from lawyer to mom, indicates that she is seeking comfort and protection from those she feels closest to, rather than facing the truth that she is being arrested for obstructing justice. Chloe's next reaction highlights her ignorance of the situation and her arrogance. When the police officer explains that she is being arrested for obstruction of justice, Chloe feels no remorse or understanding of why she is being detained. Her response, "Obstruction of justice? More like obstruction of my personal space," clearly shows her lack of comprehension and her smug attitude. Instead of accepting the truth, she reacts as though the intrusion into her personal space is the real issue. She doesn't acknowledge that her actions were wrong, but instead feels violated by the mere presence of the police officers, as if their intervention in her personal space is the real offense. This reaction is characteristic of people who refuse to take responsibility for their actions, who view themselves as the center of every situation, even when they are clearly at fault. From Chloe's dialogue, we see a portrait of a woman who holds herself in high regard, always seeing herself as the most important person and refusing to take any responsibility for her actions. She cares little for legal or ethical reasons in this situation, instead focusing on her personal sense of privacy. The contradiction in Chloe's words, first requesting a lawyer, then shifting to wanting to call her mother, demonstrates her state of panic, yet she is unable to handle the gravity of the situation. Her reaction frustrates others, making the situation unnecessarily complicated instead of cooperating and resolving the issue sensibly. Through this passage, the author skillfully paints a picture of a character, Chloe, who is entirely unaware of where she is, what she's doing, or why she is being treated in this way. She is solely focused on her personal rights, disregarding the fairness of the law. When the sound of the handcuffs clicks into place, Chloe, with a confused but self-satisfied look, makes one final attempt to escape the tense situation by calling her workplace. She quickly pulls out her phone and starts dialing while still seated in the police car, staring straight ahead, clearly displeased. "I'm going to be late," she begins, her voice a mixture of whining and pleading. "If I don't tell them, I'll definitely get fired." Chloe's words ring out as though she is facing a catastrophe of monumental proportions, as if being late for work is the most critical issue in her life right now. Her tone is not just a complaint, but also loaded with implication, as if the whole world is against her. Chloe begins to grow more tense, her complaints echoing like a diva in a Hollywood movie scene, feeling as though she has been denied some basic right, like a Starbucks coffee she thinks she deserves every morning. She continues, her tone now dripping with irritation and impatience. "I really need to get out of here. The company is calling, and I can't let them think I'm irresponsible like this." Chloe's anxiety and tension reach their peak, but what's striking is her arrogance and her belief that she is the center of attention. She couldn't care less about the legal situation she's facing, prioritizing work, a job she never clarifies is critical to her survival in society. She turns a tense situation into a purely personal, selfish concern, driven by the fear of losing face in front of her boss and colleagues. This scene is not just a simple complaint, but a clear manifestation of Chloe's character, a woman who cannot accept inconvenience or loss and always wants to control every situation, even when she is completely wrong. Her disrespect for the circumstances around her, along with her unwavering focus on her own ego, makes this action both humorous and frustrating at the same time. She doesn't realize that there are far more important things in life than minor concerns like being late for work. But, of course, for Chloe, work and personal image are everything. In this passage, Chloe clearly displays her resentment and defiant attitude toward the police, strongly reflecting the sense of injustice and ignorance she believes she is suffering. When the officer explains the reason for the stop, "We pulled you over for speeding and not wearing a seatbelt," Chloe immediately responds with a sharp and even disrespectful remark. Not only does she refuse to acknowledge her fault, but she also justifies her actions with an unexpected excuse. "Maybe the seatbelt wasn't visible because it was under my blanket. Did you think about that?" This question not only shows a lack of respect for law enforcement, but also reveals her stubbornness and inability to grasp the actual situation. Chloe is not simply arguing about her violation. She offers an argument she believes is reasonable, even though it clearly isn't convincing. She continues with, "You're just trying to ruin my whole day." This is not just an unreasonable complaint, but a way for her to shift the blame to the circumstances, trying to paint herself as the victim of a bad situation that the police set up just to ruin her day. Her words highlight the absurdity of Chloe's actions, as she refuses to take responsibility for her behavior and instead attributes fault to everything but herself. After a brief pause, Chloe ends with a bitter curse. "By the way, I hope you get some karma for this." This line clearly expresses her resentment, wishing for the officer to pay for his actions. Karma here is not just a concept of justice or retribution, but a sarcastic wish, reflecting Chloe's deep dissatisfaction with how she perceives the lack of fairness. Her words not only heighten the tension in the situation, but also highlight Chloe's self-satisfaction, as if she has the right to demand a fair outcome for herself without considering the rules and regulations she violated. To enhance this passage, one could expand on Chloe's deeper thoughts, delving into her feelings throughout the conversation with the officer. This would add more insight into her anger and the sense of unfair treatment she believes she is enduring. Such details would emphasize the contradiction between Chloe's self-perception and how society, as represented by the police, is treating her. In conclusion, Chloe's behavior in this situation is not only a clear reflection of arrogance and irresponsibility, but also a wake-up call about the lack of awareness in important situations. Her sarcasm and defiance toward the authorities demonstrate a person who not only ignores moral and legal principles but also fails to realize the seriousness of her actions. Instead of facing the truth and taking responsibility, Chloe chooses to blame the circumstances and complicate everything, solely for the sake of her ego and personal interests. The lesson to be learned from this story is the importance of being aware of our actions and respecting basic rules and principles in society. Sometimes, facing the truth, even if uncomfortable, helps us grow and understand that every action has consequences. Knowing how to accept responsibility and act reasonably will help us navigate difficult situations in a smarter and more mature way, rather than letting our ego control the situation and make everything worse.